At 2:30 p.m. on a suffocating summer day in 1938, Andrew Jackson Higgins was in a windowless conference room in the main Navy building in Washington, D.C., watching bureaucracy in action. The air was heavy with the smell of pipe tobacco, floor wax, and the self-confidence of men who had never set foot in a swamp. Higgins, a strong, impetuous Irish-American boat builder from New Orleans, knew he had perhaps 5 minutes before the men in front of him made a decision that, in his opinion, would guarantee failure in the next war. He was 800 miles from home. He was out of his habitat. Higgins was a man of action, a man of sawdust and diesel oil, whose hands were permanently stained with grease and varnish. These men before him, the wool-suited officers of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships, BU Ships, and the Bureau of Construction and Repair, were men of paper. They believed in specifications, in blueprints, and in procedures that had existed for 50 years. And they were about to officially approve their new standard landing boat. Their boat was a failure. On the conference room wall was a scale model of the Navy's pride. It was a 30-foot, about 9 meters, diesel-powered personnel launch, based on a design the Navy had used, with minor variations, since the 1920s. It was a beautiful boat, with classic naval lines, made to ferry officers from a battleship to the dock with dignity. It had a draft, the depth of water needed to float, of almost a meter. Its bow was a sharp wedge, designed to cut through harbor waves. And, most fatal of all, the only way out of it was by jumping over the sides, over the edges. "As you know, Mr. Higgins," said a stern-faced captain, leafing through a memorandum, "the Marine Corps has extensively tested our prototypes at Culebra. They are sturdy, reliable, and meet specifications." Higgins felt the blood rise to his face. Sturdy? Reliable? Sure, he growled, his New Orleans voice cutting through the polite silence. But they are coffin boats. You are building floating coffins. The problem, which Higgins saw with a visceral clarity that seemed to escape everyone in that room, was not the boat. The problem was the beach. The next war, he knew, would not be won by battleships shelling other battleships. It would be won by men, infantry, marines, getting out of the water and taking fortified beaches. And a modern fortified beach was the most efficient killing zone ever devised by man. Higgins could see it in his mind. The men in Washington saw their boats sailing in calm Caribbean waters, on exercises. Higgins saw a beach in France, or in the Pacific. He saw the lesson the world should have learned at Gallipoli in 1915, now amplified by the technology of 1938. He saw barbed wire hidden beneath the low tide. He saw steel hedgehogs designed to rip the hull of any approaching craft. He saw concrete machine gun nests, like the German MG-34, capable of firing 900 rounds per minute, perfectly positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. He saw pre-aimed mortars, just waiting for the radio call to rain explosives onto the sand. The beach was a trap. The beach was a meat grinder. Now, put the Navy's boat into that trap. The pilot, under heavy fire, would take the 30-foot launch as far as he could. But, as far as he could, was dictated by physics. With its 1-meter draft, the boat would inevitably run aground on a sandbar, perhaps 50, 70, or even 100 meters from the dry sand. The boat would stop abruptly, a stationary target. The officer on board would shout, "Disembark." And then the massacre would begin. 30 men, each carrying 80 pounds, 36 kilograms, of equipment, rifle, ammunition, assault pack, canteens, grenades, would have to stand up inside the boat, fully exposing themselves to enemy fire. One by one, they would have to throw a leg over the 1.2-meter-high side. They would fall awkwardly into the water. But the water wouldn't be ankle-deep. Because of the boat's draft, the water would be chest-deep. Or neck-deep. They would be moving at the speed of a man trying to wade through molasses. Slow. Soaked. Unbalanced. Unable to fire their weapons. And 100 meters from the nearest cover. For the enemy gunners in the bunkers, it wouldn't be combat. It would be target practice. It would be a slaughter. The men would fall in rows, their bodies floating in the red surf, their rifles sinking into the mud. Those who reached the beach would be exhausted, out of ammunition, and disorganized, only to be met by barbed wire and more fire. This was what the Bureau of Ships was approving. A recipe for disaster on an industrial scale. "Our tests indicate a disembarkation rate of 30 men in 90 seconds, said a civil engineer, adjusting his glasses. 90 seconds? Higgins exploded, slamming his hand on the mahogany table. In 90 seconds, under fire, you won't have 30 men on the beach. You'll have 30 corpses floating in the water. Don't you understand? The problem isn't getting out of the boat. The problem is where your boat stops." Higgins tried to explain. He built boats for the trappers and loggers of the Mississippi Delta. Men who needed to navigate waters full of logs, mudflats, and sandbars. His boats could operate in 18 inches, 45 centimeters, of water. His boats could slide over logs. His boats could run aground in mud and get themselves off. He had a design, the Eureka boat, which was already revolutionizing oil exploration in the Gulf. It was a flat-bottomed boat, with a protected engine and an ingenious hull that sucked water from underneath and directed it to the propeller. "Your boat," Higgins said, pointing to the model, "was designed for deep water by men who love deep water. But the war will be won in 5 meters of dirty, muddy water. And you have nothing for it." The captain presiding over the meeting cleared his throat, his face impassive. Higgins's outburst didn't impress him, it only confirmed his suspicions that he was an unruly civilian. "Thank you for your passion, Mr. Higgins. And thank you for bringing your Eureka prototype for testing. We found it interesting." Interesting was the word the Navy used for no. However, the captain continued, "The Bureau has decided that the Navy's design is superior for our needs. It fits our standard davits. Our mechanics understand its engines. It works. We are moving forward with the production contract." The meeting was over. Andrew Higgins walked out of the Navy building into the heavy Washington air. He had failed. The Navy, the organization charged with taking America's soldiers into battle, had officially chosen the wrong boat. They had chosen a boat that forced them to jump over the sides to certain death. As he watched the taxis pass, Higgins made a decision. The Navy could have its stupid designs. But if war came, they would come crawling to him. And he would be ready. He would go back to New Orleans and build his boats anyway. To hell with the bureaucracy. To hell with the Bureau of Ships. He knew he was right. And he knew the lives of thousands of men depended on it. The strategic problem wasn't just that the U.S. Navy didn't have a good landing boat. The problem was that no one in the world had one. The very idea of a successful, amphibious assault against a modern, entrenched enemy was considered a military fantasy, a tactical suicide. The dominant military thinking in the late 1930s was that World War I had proven, conclusively, that defensive firepower, specifically the machine gun and barbed wire, had made landing on a hostile beach a bloody impossibility. The word that haunted every admiral and general was Gallipoli. In 1915, the Allies tried to force the Dardanelles Strait. When the naval bombardment failed, they attempted an amphibious landing. The result was one of the greatest disasters in modern military history. British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers were transported to the beaches in open lighters, many of which were towed slowly by other vessels. The Turkish defenders, entrenched in the hills above the beaches, had Maxim machine gun nests. The result was an industrial massacre. The Allies suffered over 250,000 casualties, including 44,000 dead, for absolutely zero strategic gain. Men were cut down in the water, their bodies forming macabre reefs on the beaches of Anzac Cove. The lesson learned by a generation of military officers was unequivocal: never attempt an amphibious landing against a defended coast. However, in the late 1930s, a small group within the U.S. Marine Corps, the Fleet Marine Force, FMF, realized that the next war, a war against island nations like Japan or an invasion of a Nazi-controlled Europe, would require amphibious landings. They became America's foremost advocates for developing doctrine and equipment for the ship-to-shore assault. It was here that the brutal statistics of failure began to accumulate, not in battle, but in training exercises. The Marines conducted their fleet exercises, FLEX, on the island of Culebra, Puerto Rico. These were large-scale war simulations designed to test the new doctrine. The results were terrifying. The pattern of failure, using the standard 30-foot Bureau of Ships, BU ships, boat, was as follows. The slow approach, the Bureau's boat, even in calm waters, maxed out at 8 knots, about 14 kilometers per hour. This gave enemy, simulated, mortar gunners precious minutes to calculate range and prepare a barrage. The premature grounding, the boat, with its 1 to 1.2 meter draft, it would hit a sandbar or a submerged obstacle 50, 70, or sometimes 150 meters from the actual beach. It would stop, motionless. The lethal disembarkation, the officer would shout, "Disembark." The 30 men had to stand up, one at a time, and jump over the side rail. In ideal conditions, with no one shooting at them, referees timed this at 90 seconds to 2 minutes. 90 seconds to empty a single boat. The weight in the water, the men fell into chest-high water, holding their 4.5 kilograms rifles above their heads, fighting the waterlogged equipment and the surf. The Marine referees, positioned on the beach with the enemy defenders, were merciless in their reports. In a 1937 after-action report, a senior Marine observer calculated that, against a determined and well-equipped enemy, the expected casualty rate for the first wave using the BU ships boats would be 70% to 80%. Not 70% wounded. 70% killed or incapacitated before firing a single shot. 8 out of 10 men. The first wave would be annihilated. The second wave would land on top of their bodies and be similarly annihilated. The invasion would fail at the waterline. Enemy planners knew this. In Japan and, more crucially, in Germany, engineers were perfecting the science of beach defense. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of the Atlantic Wall, wasn't just building concrete bunkers. He was designing a layered killing zone that exploited precisely the weaknesses of the Bureau's boat. First, there were the underwater obstacles. Czech hedgehogs, 3 steel beams welded together to rip boat hulls, Belgian gates, steel gate-like structures with mines on top, and seaward slanting wooden stakes, Rommel's asparagus, with teller mines attached to them. The purpose of these obstacles was not to destroy every boat. It was to force them to stop. To force them to stop exactly where the deep draft of the Bureau's boat made it vulnerable, about 100 to 200 meters from the beach. Once the boat stopped, the second layer of defense came into play, the machine gun. The German army possessed the MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw. It was an air-cooled, belt-fed weapon capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that the sound of individual bullets merged into a single canvas-tearing noise. A single MG-42 gunner, in a concrete bunker, Tobruk, overlooking the killing zone, could fire 200 to 300 rounds in the 90 seconds it took for the Bureau boat's crew to try and jump over the sides. He didn't need to aim at individual men. He just aimed at the side of the stationary boat and swept the fire from one side to the other. This was the problem Andrew Higgins was trying to solve. And the Navy's official solution was worse than useless. The Bureau of Ships, confronted with the terrible reports from Culebra, did what bureaucracies always do: they optimized the wrong concept. They didn't change the design, they tried to improve it. They formed a committee. They suggested adding a thin steel armor plate to the sides. This, of course, made the boat heavier, slower, and increased its draft, causing it to run aground even further from the beach. They redesigned the shape of the rudder. They debated which brand of diesel engine was more reliable. They were spending millions of dollars and precious years trying to polish a boat that was fundamentally, philosophically, and fatally flawed. Their boat required men to jump out. Higgins' new survival required a boat that could get men all the way to the beach. Their boat stopped in the water. Higgins's boat could run up on the sand. But in Washington, the Bureau of Ships was in control. Their plans were approved. Their contracts were being signed. And the clock for the largest invasion in human history was ticking. Andrew Jackson Higgins was not a naval architect. He was not a Navy officer. He was not an engineer educated at MIT or the Annapolis Naval Academy. He was a loud, stocky, and profane, second-generation Irish immigrant from Columbus, Nebraska. He was a failed lumber businessman, a boat salesman, and, in 1938, at age 52, the stubborn owner of Higgins Industries in New Orleans, Louisiana. And he was, unbeknownst to the world, the most qualified person on the planet to solve the most deadly problem of World War II. His secret qualification didn't come from studying naval tactics, it came from listening to drunk trappers and desperate loggers in the Mississippi Delta. Higgins grew up far from any ocean. His passion for boats began on the shallow, muddy rivers of the prairie, like the Platte. He was a builder and a tinkerer by nature. His formal education was irregular. He studied law briefly, but his real education came from doing. He moved south, first to Alabama and then to New Orleans, drawn by the vast export lumber industry. His first major venture, importing and sawing hardwood, went bankrupt, leaving him nearly penniless. But in that failure, he found his calling. He observed the difficulty that loggers, trappers, and, later, oil prospectors had in moving through the most unforgiving terrain in North America, the Louisiana swamp. This was his laboratory. The swamp was not the deep, blue ocean that the admirals at the Bureau of Ships understood. The swamp was a labyrinth of coffee-colored water, mere centimeters deep, clogged with submerged cypress logs, floating carpets of vegetation, the floatant, and sandbars that shifted with every rain. For the men who made their living there, a boat wasn't a luxury, it was their survival tool. And their tools were failing. The standard boats of the time, with their deep V hulls and exposed propellers, were useless. They got stuck in the mud. They broke shafts and destroyed propellers on submerged debris. Getting stranded 50 miles inside the Atchafalaya swamp wasn't an inconvenience, it was a financial disaster and, potentially, a death sentence. These men didn't need a boat. They needed a truck that could cross mud, jump logs, and carry hundreds of pounds of equipment onto a muddy riverbank. This was the problem Andrew Higgins solved. He had no naval design prejudices. He didn't care about tradition. He only cared about what worked. Experimenting in his small boatyard, he developed a craft he called the Eureka. It was the product of thousands of hours of trial and error. First, he abandoned the V hull. His boats were flat-bottomed at the rear, allowing them to float in just 18 inches, 45 centimeters, of water. Second, and most crucial, was the protected propeller innovation. Higgins designed a hull where the propeller shaft and the propeller itself were recessed into a semi-tunnel within the hull. This meant the lowest part of the boat was a solid piece of wood, the propeller was shielded from impact. Third, he designed a unique, spoon-shaped bow. When the boat got up to speed, the bow didn't cut the water, it rose up and climbed the water, making the boat plane on the surface. This bow also channeled water under the hull and directly to the recessed propeller, giving it incredible traction even in shallow water. The result was a miracle boat. Local trappers said a Higgins boat could run on wet dewgrass. It could hit a sandbar at full speed, slide over it, and keep going. It could hit a submerged log and keep going. And most important of all for its future military role, it could be aimed directly at a muddy riverbank, deliver its cargo of men or equipment onto dry land, and then, by simply reversing the engine, back itself off. The man who built this boat was as unique as his creation. Higgins was the antithesis of the Washington bureaucrat. He was a charismatic and volcanic leader. He drank whiskey with his carpenters and welders. He yelled, he cursed, and he gesticulated, but he also inspired fanatical loyalty. His New Orleans factory ran 24/7 in a state of organized and noisy chaos. He was an original hacker, an intuitive innovator who sketched designs on bar napkins and then turned them into wooden prototypes in 72 hours. When Bureau of Ships officers told him his designs violated standard naval regulations, Higgins laughed at them. "You don't know anything about boats," he would shout. "You only know about papers." He was impatient, abrasive, and absolutely sure of himself. He didn't see boat building as a slow, methodical, committee-approved process. He saw it as a war of physics. And he was winning. While the Navy was perfecting its 30-foot coffin boat, Higgins was selling hundreds of Eureka boats to the oil industry, which used them to explore the Gulf of Mexico. He was already building for the U.S. Coast Guard, which loved his boats for their speed and durability in shallow coastal waters. Therefore, in 1938, when Higgins confronted the men in Washington, he wasn't just selling a design. He was representing a completely different philosophy of design. The admirals saw the ocean as a deep, open space. Higgins saw the ocean for what it was at the point of conflict, the last 100 meters of dirty, shallow, treacherous water. The admirals wanted a boat that worked at sea. Higgins had spent 20 years perfecting a boat that worked where the sea ended. He was the only person who understood that the problem wasn't navigating to the beach, but surviving it. The no from the Bureau of Ships in 1938 didn't stop Andrew Higgins, it only enraged him. But the real catalyst for innovation didn't come from the bureaucrats he despised, but from the only men he respected, the Marines. Although Boo ships had rejected Higgins, the Marines were desperate. They managed to buy a few Eureka boats from Higgins with limited funds, designating them as LCP, Landing Craft, Personnel. In their 1940 exercises, they tested them against the Bureau's boats. The result was a revelation. Higgins's boat was 50% faster. It could carry 36 men, versus the Bureau boat's 30. It could navigate shallow waters that paralyzed the official Navy boat. It could beach itself and back itself off. In every aspect, except one, it was perfect. That one was the original problem. A young Marine officer, Lieutenant Victor Brute Krulak, who would later become a legendary general, sent a blunt report. The Eureka boat, he wrote, was magnificent. But to disembark, the men still had to jump over the 1.2-meter sides. The only difference was that now they were jumping into knee-deep water, instead of chest-deep. It was better, but it was still a deadly bottleneck. The men were still exposed one at a time, like ducks in a shooting gallery, right in front of the enemy machine guns. Krulak, who had observed the Japanese using bow-ramped landing craft in China, was direct. "Mr. Higgins, your boat is great. But it needs a ramp. Our men need to get out the front, now." To Higgins, this was a thunderbolt. He had spent 20 years perfecting a boat that was defined by its indestructible and hydrodynamically brilliant spoonbill bow. And now the Marines wanted him to cut a hole in it. The scene of inspiration was not a quiet moment. It was a series of explosive arguments in his chaotic office in New Orleans in late 1940. Higgins was with his chief engineer, Adolph Zundel. Maps, blueprints, and engine specifications covered every surface. "A ramp!" Higgins reportedly yelled, throwing a pencil against the wall. "Do they think we're stupid? You cut an 8-foot hole in the front of a boat and you know what happens? It sinks. That's the part that hits the waves. And if it doesn't sink," Zundel, a more methodical engineer, would have replied, "it destroys the design. The spoonbill bow is what makes us climb the water. Replace it with a flat barn door and our draft doubles. We might as well be building the Bureau's boat." They were stuck. The bow was the key to the boat's success, but also the barrier to its ultimate function. Higgins spent days walking the factory floor, watching his men shape the plywood hulls. The problem churned in his mind. You can't cut the bow. You can't cut the bow. And then came the click. One of those inversions of logic that define genius. "We're not going to cut the bow," he told Zundel, grabbing a piece of chalk and starting to sketch on the dusty factory floor. "We're going to split it. The ramp doesn't replace the bow. The ramp becomes the bow." The idea was brilliant, counterintuitive, and an engineering nightmare. Here was the physics and theory behind the world-changing solution. The theory and physics of the bow ramp. The challenge was divided into 4 seemingly unsolvable problems. Problem of hydrodynamics. The Eureka's spoonbill bow worked because its curved, composite shape pushed water down and to the sides, allowing the boat to rise up and plane. A flat, blunt ramp would act like a brake, plowing water and killing speed. The solution: the ramp wouldn't be flat. The steel ramp itself would be pressed and welded to have the same curvature as the original bow. The fixed bow, cheeks on either side of the ramp would maintain that spoon shape. When the ramp was closed, it would fit perfectly, and the boat, viewed from below or the side, would have almost exactly the same hydrodynamic profile as the original Eureka. It would still climb. Problem of structural integrity. In any boat, the bow is a vital structural beam that holds the two sides of the hull together. Cutting an 8-foot hole in it was like sawing through the main beam of a roof. The boat would fold in half under the impact of a heavy wave. The solution, the ramp, when closed, would be the main beam. Higgins and Zundel designed a system where the steel ramp didn't just close, it was pulled tight against the frame by a steel cable winch. Massive steel latches on both sides would engage, making the ramp a fully integrated structural component. To compensate, they added steel stringers running along the inside sides of the plywood hull, creating a steel-wood hybrid that was, in fact, stronger than the original Eureka. Problem of watertightness. This was the bureaucrats' biggest concern. A ramp at the waterline, slamming into 5-foot waves, would leak. And even a small leak, over a 30-minute trip from ship to shore, would flood the boat and sink 36 men and their equipment. The solution. First, the boat's hydrodynamics helped. When planing, the ramp was actually well above the waterline. But for when it was stationary, Higgins designed a thick, flexible rubber gasket seal around the entire opening. The pressure from the cable winch, pulling the ramp shut, would compress this rubber, creating a watertight seal. Problem of mechanism. The ramp would need to be steel to resist bullets and impacts. This meant it would weigh hundreds of pounds. How could 36 tired, scared men open and close it quickly under fire? The solution, simplicity. The same Hall-Scott or Gray Marine diesel engine that drove the propeller would have a power takeoff, PTO, essentially a secondary gear. This PTO would drive a small winch. The coxswain would have a single lever. Pulling it back would engage the winch clutch, using the engine's power to wind the cable and raise the ramp in seconds. Pushing it forward would release the clutch, allowing the ramp to fall by controlled gravity. The prototype. Higgins didn't wait for a contract. He didn't ask the Bureau of Ships for permission. He paid out of his own pocket. He and Zundel took a 36-foot, 11-meter, Eureka hull from stock. To the horror of the traditional boat builders in his yard, Higgins took a piece of chalk and drew a cut line on the bow. "Cut it," he ordered. They took a saw and amputated the front of his best-selling boat. In a matter of weeks, using his own welders and mechanics working around the clock, they fabricated the first crude steel ramp, installed the massive hinges, ran the cables, and hooked up the winch to the engine. The test on Lake Pontchartrain. Higgins's laboratory was Lake Pontchartrain, a vast, shallow body of water north of New Orleans. On a cold day in early 1941, Higgins, Zundel, and a team of marine observers, including, according to legend, Krulak himself, took the prototype out on the water. The first part of the test was buoyancy. The boat floated. The ramp, compressed by the winch, was dry. Higgins took the helm. He revved the engine. The boat responded. It didn't plow. It rose onto the water and planed, just like the Eureka. The hydrodynamics were intact. "Hold on!" Higgins yelled. He turned the boat and aimed it directly at the lake's muddy shore at full speed. The Navy observers held their breath. The boat hit the bank with a dull thud and slid several meters into the mud, stopping abruptly. The engine didn't die, the protected propeller was safe. Higgins pulled the lever. With a whine from the winch and a deafening clang of steel hitting sand, the ramp dropped. There was a moment of stunned silence. The ramp formed a perfect, dry, stable bridge from the boat's deck to the firm ground. The Marines on board didn't wait for an order. They ran out, not jumping, not climbing, but running, down the ramp and onto dry ground in less than 10 seconds. Higgins looked at the ramp, and then at the men on the beach. He knew. He hadn't just modified a boat. He had just made the invasion of Europe possible. Armed with the test results from Lake Pontchartrain and an ecstatic report from the Marine Corps observers, Andrew Higgins returned to Washington, D.C. in early 1941. This time, he wasn't selling a theory. He was delivering a proven solution. He expected, if not an apology, at least a reluctant acceptance. Instead, he was met with icy bureaucratic fury. Higgins's innovation was not seen as a solution, it was seen as a direct attack. He hadn't just solved a problem, he had, arrogantly and publicly, proven that the Bureau of Ships' entire multi-million-dollar design process was wrong. And he had done it without permission, without following proper channels, and using methods the Navy considered anathema. The meeting in the Navy building was brief and brutal. The same officers who had previously dismissed him with condescension now saw him as a dangerous problem. "Mr. Higgins," said a ship's admiral, "we have received the Marine's report. It is enthusiastic. However, your craft is unacceptable for at least 4 reasons." He began to list the violations. First, the most important rule in any bureaucracy, violation of established specifications. The Navy has determined that the standard landing craft will be 30 feet long to fit the existing davits on our attack transports. Your boat is 36 feet. It does not fit. End of story. Second, violation of materials doctrine. The Bureau, the Admiral continued, is moving towards steel hulls for all combat craft, for obvious reasons of durability and protection. Your boat, we are informed, is made of plywood. To the naval architects of 1941, this was heresy. Plywood was the material of fruit crates and dollhouses. The idea of sending men onto a beach defended by Krupp artillery inside a glued-together boat was ludicrous, an insult to naval engineering. Higgins tried to argue that his waterproof resin, plywood was, in fact, lighter, cheaper, and incredibly more resilient than steel. A machine gun bullet would punch a clean hole in the wood, which could be plugged in seconds by a soldier with a wooden dowel, whereas it would cause steel to shatter, creating deadly shrapnel. They wouldn't listen. Third, violation of procurement procedure. You built this prototype, another officer said, without a development contract. You are attempting to bypass the Navy's established testing process by using your friends in the Marine Corps to apply undue pressure. That is not how we work. And finally, the most damning violation of fundamental naval practice. A ramp on the bow, said the Chief Admiral, is, and always will be, structurally unsound. It may have worked on a Louisiana lake. In a Channel Sea with 2-meter waves, it will be torn off, and your boat will sink. We will not risk the lives of 36 men on your gimmick. The official no was final. The Bureau of Ships informed Higgins that they were finalizing a mass production contract for their 30-foot steel-hulled boat, the LCP-L, landing craft, personnel, large. Higgins Industries was not invited to bid. The risk Andrew Higgins now faced was not theoretical. It was existential. He had bet everything he had on this boat. While he was in Washington hearing no, his factories in New Orleans were already undergoing a massive transformation. He had told his men to make room. Anticipating victory, he had used his own capital and taken out crippling bank loans to buy vast stockpiles of African mahogany, fir plywood, and hundreds of Hall-Scott marine engines. He was building new assembly lines on land he could barely afford. If the Navy's no held, Andrew Higgins would be bankrupt in 6 months. Higgins Industries would be liquidated, its 4,000 employees would be on the street, and he would be remembered as an arrogant businessman who bet the farm against the U.S. Navy and lost. He would be a professional pariah, permanently blacklisted from any future government contracts. Heavier than the financial ruin was the moral risk. Higgins knew he was right. He knew, with the certainty of a prophet, that the Bureau's boat was a meat grinder. If he accepted the no, he would be complicit in the massacre he knew was coming. He returned to New Orleans that night. He summoned his engineering team, Adolf Zundel, his chief designer, and his factory managers. The air in the cigarette smoke-stinking office was heavy. They said no, Higgins declared. They are going to build those steel coffins. The contract is going to Chris Kraft. The silence was absolute. The men saw their jobs, their company, evaporating. So, what do we do, Andrew? Asked Zundel. Higgins slammed his fist on the table. What do? We go to war. To hell with the Bureau of Ships. To hell with their contract. We're going to build ours. We're going to build them now. It was a decision of total rebellion. He was declaring war on one of the most powerful branches of the U.S. government. He was going to build hundreds of 36-foot boats, on spec, without a single purchase order. He was betting that the reality of the coming war and the pressure from his co-conspirators would make his innovation not just desirable, but inevitable. And he had powerful co-conspirators. While Higgins was risking his financial empire, the Marine Corps officers who had witnessed the Lake Pontchartrain test were committing their own kind of mutiny. Lieutenants and colonels of the Fleet Marine Force, men like Victor Krulak, were risking their careers. They began writing memos that violated the chain of command. They bypassed the Bureau of Ships completely. Their reports, comparing the Bouchipse's coffin boat with Higgins's miracle boat, were sent directly to the office of the Chief of Naval Operations and to congressional committees. It was an immense career risk. If a Bouchipse admiral decided to retaliate, a young Marine lieutenant's career could end in a supply depot in Alaska. But, like Higgins, they had seen the future. They knew the beaches of the Pacific would not be taken by jumping over the side into chest-deep water. The rebellion was underway. In New Orleans, the sound of saws and pneumatic hammers filled the air, 24 hours a day, as Higgins built an invasion fleet no one had ordered. In Washington, the Marines waged a memo war, trying to force the Navy to buy the boat it had already rejected. The race was on. While America, in the summer of 1941, was still nominally at peace, a private war was being waged in full force on the banks of Bayou St. John in New Orleans. Andrew Higgins's surgery was not a 60-second modification on a single engine, it was the re-engineering of an entire industry, a clandestine mass-scale operation happening in plain sight. The scene at the Higgins Industries factories was one of productive chaos. The place didn't look like a traditional shipyard, with its quiet dry docks and methodical processes. It looked, as one observer described it, like a cross between a sawmill gone berserk and a Detroit assembly line that caught on fire. The air was so thick with mahogany sawdust and welding smoke that men tied handkerchiefs over their faces. The sound was a continuous industrial assault, 24 hours a day, the high-pitched shriek of circular saws cutting through inch-thick fir plywood, the thwack-thwack-thwack of pneumatic hammers riveting steel plates, and the deep roar of Hallscott marine engines being test-fired on benches. In the midst of this pandemonium was Andrew Higgins, his white linen suit now stained with grease, shouting orders over the din. He had transformed his workforce. He hired thousands. He didn't care about race, gender, or experience, he cared about speed. He promoted an African-American woman, Thelma Molly Mulbert, to superintendent, an unheard-of move in the segregated South. He was running the only fully racially integrated workplace in the South, not out of idealism, though he despised local prejudices, but out of sheer pragmatic necessity. He needed the best boat builders, period. The surgery was happening on a makeshift assembly line he had designed. The plywood hull started upside down, where workers applied the waterproofing resin. Then, cranes would flip them, and they would move down the rails. At one station, a team installed the steel stringers that reinforced the hull. At the next, a crane lowered the 250-horsepower Hallscott engine into its mount. And at the final, most critical station, teams of welders installed the prefabricated steel ramps, the winches, and the steel cables. Every boat that rolled off the line was a direct violation of the Bureau of Ships orders. Every one was a 36-foot boat made of fruit crate plywood, with a structurally unsound hole in the front. And Higgins was building them as fast as he could, without a single purchase order. The tension of the wait was not the 40-minute anguish of a junior officer, it was the months-long agony of a captain of industry betting his empire. Higgins spent his nights in his office, which overlooked the factory floor, staring down at the chaos he had created. He was burning cash at an unimaginable rate. The weekly payroll ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The trucks delivering African mahogany and Oregon fir arrived with invoices demanding payment in 30 days. His bankers in New Orleans, who had initially backed him, were getting nervous. They called daily, their once friendly voices now strained, asking about the Navy contracts he had promised. "They're coming," Higgins would lie, his voice booming over the phone. "We've had a little hang-up at Bouchip's. Bureaucracy, you know." But the telegrams from Bouchip's weren't purchase orders. They were cease and desist orders. They were notifications that the Navy was moving forward with sea trials of the Chris-Craft steel prototype. Higgins was being officially frozen out. The imminent risk was total bankruptcy. If the war didn't come, or if Bouchip's managed to get its own boat approved first, Higgins wouldn't just have to lay off his 8,000 employees. He would lose everything. His factories, his patents, his house. The banks would foreclose on it all. And the back lot, which was now filling with rows upon rows of matte gray landing craft, would become the world's most expensive boat graveyard. He was calculating the cash burn in his head. He could hold out until October. Maybe November. After that, payroll wouldn't be met. He wasn't alone in this clandestine preparation. In Washington, his co-conspirators in the Marine Corps were fighting the second front of this war. Lieutenant Krulak and others were no longer just writing reports. They were actively breaking protocol. They took the films from the Lake Pontchartrain test, showing Marines sprinting down the ramp in 10 seconds, and accidentally screened them for members of the House Naval Affairs Committee. They leaked the performance data comparing the speed and draft of Higgins's boat against the slow, deep Bouchip's prototype. It was a quiet mutiny. The Marines were openly telling Congress that the Navy's Bureau of Ships was about to force them into battle armed with a tool that would get them killed. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, another boat rolled off the line. And another. And another. Higgins lined them up in every square foot of free space he owned. The tension was unbearable. It was the fall of 1941. He had an invasion fleet growing daily, a weapon that could win the war, and no buyer. He was on the verge of ruin. He just needed reality to arrive. The climax of Andrew Higgins's rebellion didn't happen on a bullet-swept beach, but on a cold, wind-swept strip of sand in Norfolk, Virginia, in the late fall of 1941. The relentless pressure from the Marines and Congress had finally forced the Bureau of Ships to do the unthinkable, hold a side-by-side competitive trial. The atmosphere was thick with hostility. On one side of the beach, sitting in the calm water, was the Bureau's pride, the official Navy landing boat, fresh from the Chris-Craft shipyards. It was the LCP-L, landing craft, personnel, large. It was 30 feet, 9 meters, long, made of solid naval steel, and had the clean, Bureau-approved lines. Anchored near it, looking like a clumsy interloper, was Higgins's boat. It was 36 feet, 11 meters, made of cheap-looking plywood, and had a brutal-looking steel ramp bolted to its front. On the beach, a group of men watched with binoculars. It was a tense mix of both sides of Higgins's war. There were the admirals and engineers from the Bureau of Ships, in their greatcoats and with clipboards, looking confident that their superior steel design would humiliate the Southerners' wooden toy. Beside them stood the Marine Corps officers, including Victor Krulak, their faces impassive, praying the boat they had bet their careers on would perform under pressure. And, most importantly, there was a delegation from the House Naval Affairs Committee, the men who signed the checks. The test was simple. Each boat would load a platoon of 36 fully equipped Marines, navigate a 1.6 kilometers, 1 mile course in choppy coastal water, drive through the surf, and land the men on the beach. The time would be clocked from start to finish. The Bureau's boat went first. A whistle blew. The 36 Marines began to board. The process was immediately slow. Because the men had to jump over the steel boat's high sides from a dock, it took nearly 3 minutes to get everyone loaded. Finally, the boat set off. It was visibly slow, its diesel engine laboring against the weight of the steel. It chugged through the course, heavy and low in the water, plowing through the waves rather than riding over them. Then, it approached the beach. The coxswain drove the boat as far as he could, but the physics were relentless. About 60 meters, 200 feet, from the dry sand, with an audible screech of metal scraping on sand, the boat ran aground. Its deep draft had hung it up on a sandbar, exactly as Higgins had predicted in Washington 3 years earlier. The boat was stationary, a sitting duck. "Disembark," the officer on board yelled. What followed was painful chaos. The men had to stand up, one by one, and struggle to climb over the 1.2-meter, 4-foot, steel side. They dropped awkwardly into cold, chest-deep water. One Marine snagged his equipment pack on the side and was nearly pulled under. Another, top-heavy, slipped and had to be grabbed by his comrades. They moved through the 60-meter killing zone with agonizing slowness, their rifles useless above their heads, the icy water sucking their strength. On the beach, an officer with a stopwatch looked up. Time to disembark 36 men from craft, 2 minutes, 18 seconds. Total time to reach dry beach, 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The ship's admirals made notes, their faces grim. The performance was subpar, but it was within specifications. Then, it was Higgins's turn. As legend has it, Andrew Higgins himself insisted on piloting the boat. The same 36 Marines, now soaked and shivering, marched up to Higgins's boat. The ramp was down. They didn't climb, they ran up it, in a column of twos, as if boarding a bus. Loading time, under 30 seconds. "Ramp up!" Higgins yelled. He threw the winch lever. With a whine, the ramp rose and slammed shut with a solid clang. Higgins gunned the 250 horsepower Hallscott engine. The boat didn't chug, it leaped. The much lighter plywood hull allowed the boat to immediately get up and plane over the very waves that had bogged down the steel boat. It zoomed over the same 1-mile course in less than half the time. The observers on the beach barely had time to raise their binoculars. Higgins was coming straight for them, throwing a high, white rooster tail of spray. He didn't slow down as he approached the beach. He didn't worry about the sandbar. The Marines on board braced for impact. Higgins kept the throttle wide open. The boat hit the sandbar at nearly 20 knots. There was a shush sound, not a screech of metal, but the sound of resin plywood sliding over wet sand. The boat shot over the sandbar like a sled and kept going, finally stopping with a dull thud as the entire bow ran hard aground on the dry sand. The nearest water was behind them. "Ramp down." Higgins released the winch. With a clang that echoed down the beach, the 8-foot steel bridge dropped onto the sand. For a second, no one moved. Then the officer on board roared, "Go! Go! Go!" It wasn't a trickle. It was an explosion. The 36 Marines, yelling with adrenaline, burst out of the boat in a cohesive mass. They were in platoon formation, weapons ready, sprinting up the beach before the observers could lower their binoculars. The stopwatch officer looked at his watch, disbelieving. He looked again. Time to disembark 36 men, 10 seconds. 10 seconds. The reversal was total. There was no debate. There was no discussion of specifications. The ship's admirals were in absolute silence, their clipboards useless in their hands. A congressman from the Naval Affairs Committee slowly lowered his binoculars. He turned to the Chief Admiral of the Bureau of Ships, his voice quiet and dangerously cold. "Admiral," the congressman said, "I have just watched your multi-million-dollar boat take nearly 4 minutes to land soaking wet men 60 yards offshore. And I have just watched Mr. Higgins's plywood boat land the same men, dry and ready to fight, in 10 seconds. He paused. "The Navy will not be building another steel boat. You will give Mr. Higgins a contract for as many of these as he can build. Today." Andrew Higgins's battle was won. The clandestine preparation was over. Mass production could begin. And he was right just in time. Less than 3 weeks later, on December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor would plunge the United States into the war Higgins knew was coming, and for which he was now the only man with the tool to win it. Andrew Higgins's victory on the Norfolk beach wasn't the end of the story, it was the starting pistol for a production race the world had never seen. The bureaucratic pendulum, once stuck on the inertia of no, swung with cataclysmic violence to a panicked yes. The attack on Pearl Harbor, weeks after the trial, transformed the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, as the boat was quickly redesignated, from a Louisiana curiosity into the most critically needed weapon in the Allied arsenal. The bottom-up demand became a deafening roar. It was no longer just the Marines. The U.S. Army, now tasked with planning Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, and the eventual invasion of Europe, realized their entire strategic plan hinged on that plywood boat. Planners in London, working on the initial stages of Operation Overlord, didn't ask if they would use Higgins's boat, they asked how many thousands they could get in time. Andrew Higgins's problem changed overnight. He no longer had to fight for acceptance, he had to achieve the impossible. The Navy's first official order was breathtaking. They didn't want 50 boats. They wanted 1,500, and they wanted them immediately. Shortly after, that order swelled to 5,000. Then 10,000. Higgins, the man who had risked bankruptcy to build a few dozen boats, on spec, was now the industrial bottleneck on which the entire Allied strategy depended. The bureaucracy, now entirely on his side, buckled spectacularly. The Bureau of Ships, with a forced humility, didn't just approve the design, they made it the universal standard. All other personnel landing craft projects were summarily cancelled. The Chris-Craft steel boat became an embarrassing footnote. Higgins's 36-foot LCVP was now the only tool for the job. But how to build them? Higgins Industries was a medium-sized boatyard in New Orleans. The Navy needed a city-sized fleet. Here, Higgins's secret qualification shined again. He wasn't a traditional boat builder, he was a mass-production genius. He looked at his boatyards and didn't see a place to build boats one at a time, he saw a place to manufacture boats like Henry Ford manufactured cars. Higgins Industries exploded. The workforce swelled from 4,000 to over 25,000 in less than 18 months. Higgins's workplace became a legend. He hired anyone who could hold a tool, women, African Americans, the elderly, the physically disabled. He ran the most integrated workforce in the South, paying equal wages for equal work, not out of altruism, but because he had a war to win and no time for prejudice. He called his workers, "My Navy." He revolutionized the very idea of boat building. Before Higgins, boats were built statically, a keel was laid, and workers brought materials to it. Higgins created the boat assembly line. LCVP hulls were built upside down on movable jigs that slid on rails. At one station, the mahogany stringers and plywood skin were affixed. The hull then rolled to the next station, where it was flipped upright and a team of plumbers and electricians installed the fuel tanks and wiring. At the next, a crane lowered the Hull-Scott or Gray Marine engine into its mount. At the next, welders installed the steel ramp, winch, and coxswain's armor plate. What once took weeks to build was now completed in days. At the peak of production, Higgins Industries' 7 plants in New Orleans were churning out 700 boats a month. A brand new LCVP rolled off the assembly line every hour. The logistical challenge was monumental. African mahogany, which Higgins preferred for its rot resistance, became scarce due to the U-boat war in the Atlantic. Boo ships, now in a panic, suggested changing to steel. Higgins flatly refused. Instead, he experimented. He proved that Douglas fir and Oregon pine, when laminated and bonded with his waterproof phenolic resin, were just as strong and even lighter. But even Higgins's empire couldn't meet the demand. The Navy needed more. The implementation of Higgins's innovation now required him to do something he hated, give up control. The U.S. Navy used its war powers to force Higgins to license his patents, his bow ramp design, his hydrodynamic hull, to other companies. In one of the war's greatest ironies, Chris-Craft, the very company that had built the rival steel boat, was ordered to stop production and start building Higgins's plywood LCVPs. Other companies that once made luxury furniture or pianos were converted, using Higgins's blueprints. Higgins's implementation tour wasn't him flying to naval bases to teach tactics. It was him sending his chief engineers, like Adolf Zundel, to his competitors' factories with his jigs, his assembly line methods, and his production secrets. He had to teach his corporate enemies how to copy his innovation perfectly. The adoption was total. By 1943, the LCVP wasn't called a Higgins boat anymore. It was simply the landing craft. It became the ubiquitous tool of amphibious assault in every theater. The men who piloted them, Coast Guard and Navy coxswains, often only 18 or 19 years old, became a brotherhood. They learned the art of catching the wave, finding a gap in Rommel's obstacles, and ramming the beach hard enough to get the men off, but not so hard they couldn't back off and escape the kill zone to get another load. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Sicily to Anzio, it was Higgins's boat that did the work. The bottom-up demand was absolute. No general or admiral would dream of planning a landing without it. Andrew Higgins's rebellion was over. His industrial revolution had won. The turning point was not a single moment, but a cascade of strategic victories made possible by Andrew Higgins's solution. The final statistical proof of his innovation wasn't written in a Bureau of Ships report, but on the world map, redrawn by men who landed from his boats. Let's revisit the before numbers. The failure scenario, as established by the Culebra exercises and the Bureau of Ships design, was as follows. Projected casualty rate, wave 1 70% to 80%. Disembarkation time, 30 men 90 to 120 seconds. Landing zone, 50 to 100 meters offshore, in chest-deep water. Result, annihilation of the assault force at the waterline. Now, the after numbers, as proven in combat. First test, Operation Torch, North Africa, November 1942, this was the first large-scale trial by fire for the LCVP. Hundreds of them, many fresh off the New Orleans assembly lines, carried the first waves of the U.S. Army onto the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. The landings weren't easy, nighttime confusion and inexperienced coxswains caused problems. But the boat itself was a roaring success. On the beaches near Fidala, Morocco, planners had predicted treacherous sandbars that should have stopped the invasion. The LCVPs, with their shallow draft inherited from the Louisiana swamps, slid right over them, delivering the men dry on the beach, exactly as Higgins had promised. The invasion was a success. The first major Allied amphibious assault of the war proved the theory worked. The Pacific turning point, Tarawa, November 1943, the Battle of Tarawa was a bloodbath that nearly became a total disaster, and it was saved from absolute failure by the LCVP. Naval planners miscalculated the tide. As the first wave of Marines approached Bidio Atoll, they found the surrounding coral reef was covered by only 2 or 3 feet, 60 to 90 centimeters, of water, too shallow for their heavier support craft, the LCMs, landing craft, mechanized, to cross. The Amtraks, LVTs, that led the assault were decimated by Japanese fire. The subsequent waves of Marines were in LCMs that ran aground on the reef, 800 yards, 730 meters, from the beach. The Marines were forced to disembark and wade the 800 yards in chest-deep water, under devastating machine gun fire. It was the Buship's nightmare made real. But it was the LCVPs that saved the day. With their 3-foot, 90 centimeters, draft aft and mere 2-foot, 60 centimeters, draft forward, LCVP coxswains, under intense fire, were the only ones who could find channels and hop over the reef, bringing wave after wave of men much closer to the beach. They couldn't get all the way to the sand, but they could get men to 200 yards, instead of 800. Without Higgins's boat, the casualty rate wouldn't have been 35%, it would have been 100%. Tarawa would have been a Pacific Gallipoli. Admiral Nimitz, shocked by the losses, concluded that without LCVPs and LVTs, the landing would have failed completely. The final payoff, D-Day, Operation Overlord, June 6, 1944, this was the moment the LCVP was built for. Erwin Rommel's Atlantic Wall was the most sophisticated beach defense in history, designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses of a traditional amphibious landing. Its underwater minefields, steel hedgehogs, and Rommel's asparagus stakes were all designed to do exactly one thing: force the landing boats to stop and ground themselves 100 to 200 meters offshore, where the pre-sighted MG-42 machine guns and mortars could annihilate them. Rommel's plan was perfect: to defeat the Bureau of Ships' boat. He never planned for Higgins's boat. On the morning of June 6, an armada of 1,083 LCVPs, not counting hundreds of other Higgins craft, like the LCMs, formed the spearhead of the invasion on Utah and Omaha beaches. On Utah Beach, the success was near perfect. The LCVPs glided between the low-tide obstacles, their ramps dropped on the dry sand, and the men of the 4th Infantry Division ran out, almost untouched. On Omaha Beach, this was the brutal test. The preliminary bombardment had failed. The German defenses were intact. The tide was rising, hiding Rommel's obstacles. The LCVP coxswains, most of them teenagers from the Coast Guard, drove into a hell of artillery, mortar, and the canvas-tearing fire of the MG-42s. Here, Higgins's innovation made the difference between disaster and a razor-thin victory. The Bureau's boats, with their deep draft, would have been hung up 100% of the time on the obstacles. They would have been forced to disembark men into neck-deep water, exactly where Rommel wanted them. The slaughter would have been total, the invasion would have failed. But the LCVPs gave the men a chance. Their skilled, terrified pilots used the speed and the flat bottom to ram over the obstacles, or navigate between them. Though many boats were destroyed, hundreds made it through. They rammed their bows onto the beach shingle, the ramp dropped, and the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, though suffering terrible casualties, got onto the beach. They were dry. Their weapons worked. They could fight. The final statistic is this: 160,000 men landed on the Normandy beaches in the first 24 hours. The overwhelming majority of them got there on a plywood boat from New Orleans. The final production numbers: by the war's end in August 1945, Higgins Industries and its licensees had built 23,358 Higgins boats. They were used in every single major Allied invasion, from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Andrew Higgins's rebellion had changed the math of war. The before was an 80% casualty rate and an impossible invasion. The after was a 100% success rate in strategic amphibious assaults and the liberation of 2 continents. The Bouchipsa's coffin boat would have lost the war. Andrew Higgins's useless boat won it. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, Andrew Jackson Higgins was the most famous industrialist in New Orleans, the head of a manufacturing empire that employed over 25,000 men and women in 7 factories. His Navy, as he called it, had produced a fleet of 23,358 vessels. He had done the impossible, and America hailed him as a production hero. But peace is a cruel master for men built for war. Andrew Higgins's immediate fate was as abrupt and brutal as the innovation that made him famous. With the surrender of Japan, the telegrams from the Navy Department were no longer frantic requests for more boats, they were cold, contract cancellation orders. Almost overnight, the demand that had employed a city dried up. Higgins's Navy was disbanded. Thousands of workers, the women, the African Americans, the elderly he had trained and empowered, were let go. The sound of saws and rivet guns that had echoed 24/7 on Bayou St. John was replaced by an eerie silence. Higgins, the crisis production genius, tried desperately to pivot his empire to peace. He was an innovator to the end. He designed and built sleek recreational boats, using the same plywood principles as his landers. He tried to market helicopters, prefabricated houses, and even an early version of a fiberglass hull. But he was a man of speed and scale, not consumer marketing and tight profit margins. Higgins Industries, saddled with the debts of its massive wartime expansion and unable to compete in the civilian market, struggled. In 1952, just 7 years after VJ Day, Andrew Higgins died suddenly of a stomach ulcer. He was 65. At the time of his death, his empire was in sharp decline. The company bearing his name would eventually file for bankruptcy and close its doors a few years later. To the general public, his name quickly faded from the national consciousness, replaced by the more familiar heroes of the battlefield. But the fate of his innovation was the exact opposite. The LCVP did not die with its creator. It became immortal. The U.S. Navy, though it had dismissed Higgins, fully embraced his design. The bow ramp became unquestioned design dogma. The 36-foot plywood boat evolved, first into steel, and then into aluminum. Today, more than 80 years later, when the U.S. Navy and Marines prepare for an amphibious assault, they don't use a copy of Higgins's boat, they use its direct descendants. The LCU, landing craft utility, and the LCM-8 Mike boat that ferry tanks, Humvees, and troops onto beaches around the world are just larger, stronger, turbine-powered LCVPs. The physical logic of the spoonbill bow, the flat bottom, and the ramp that becomes the bow remains completely unchanged. More profoundly, Higgins's idea, driving straight onto the beach, changed how the world moves things. The roll-on/roll-off (RRO) ramp idea became the basis for modern maritime shipping. Every car ferry that shuttles vehicles from an island to the mainland, every massive cargo ship that lowers a ramp to discharge trucks in a port, every civilian vehicle lander is a spiritual grandchild of the boat Higgins designed for the Louisiana swamps. Higgins's cultural memory, though it faded for decades, was eventually salvaged and cemented in the place of his greatest rebellion, New Orleans. For years, the story was just a local legend. But in the late 1990s, historian Stephen Ambrose, author of Band of Brothers, was working to found the National D-Day Museum. Investors wanted it built in Washington, D.C., Kansas City, or another militarily significant city. Ambrose refused. He insisted the museum must be in New Orleans, and nowhere else. When asked why, Ambrose gave a simple answer: because this is where the war was won. The National World War II Museum, one of the most visited and revered institutions in the country, stands in New Orleans for one reason: to honor Andrew Jackson Higgins. In its main entry pavilion, visitors are greeted not by a tank or a plane, but by a fully restored 36-foot LCVP, suspended in the air. It is the first thing you see, the artifact that defines the museum. The moral of the story was best summarized by the man who depended on Higgins the most. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had no doubts about the boat builder's legacy. Andrew Higgins, Eisenhower said after the war, is the man who won the war for us. Eisenhower, a master of logistics, understood what the ship's bureaucrats had not. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, he explained, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. There would have been no Operation Torch. There would have been no Anzio. There would have been no Pacific. And most importantly, there would have been no D-Day. The invasion of Europe would have been a tactical impossibility. Andrew Higgins's legacy is a brutal testament that war-winning innovation rarely comes from committees. It comes from stubborn, passionate outsiders, from hackers who understand the real problem because they've lived it. The Bureau of Ships was trying to build a boat to fit their davits. Higgins built a boat to win a war. The useless boat, the Navy rejected, the plywood fruit crate from a loud-mouthed Irishman in Louisiana, turned out to be the keel upon which the liberation of the world rested.